Alrighty. I'm actually going to have to go and fire up the web browser again because I need to be able to use the window capture. Assuming that that is a thing that will make sense for me today. Who knows, maybe it won't work. Maybe this is the day that I can't even do top chat because it'll be overwhelmed with nonsense. Oh god, and it's calling itself music live streaming. That's no good. I need to fix that. Let me see what I can fix about all of this. I gotta switch over and hopefully they haven't changed all the settings around until I can no longer use the system I need to use. Which seems to be so often the way these things work. I don't like it, but it is. So let's see. Now when I go to YouTube Studio, it's showing me all kinds of silly bullshit. News, Creator Insider. I don't want any of those things. Shut up. We'll try going to videos and see if that's any help. And go into live, and I should be able to change the name of all this. Let's go here, and I'll have the chat up in a moment, don't you worry. I'm definitely a little burnt today. Saving. There we go. And I believe I need to... Do I not get to deal with my chat anymore? Is that something that I'm not allowed to even show the chat or see what it is? That's going to be a big problem. I no longer know what I'm doing. Maybe I need to change it to other features. They say, until all the features are built, you can switch over to this thing. We've switched over to the thing. It's still not showing me what I need. Live dashboard. Because you know what I need, aha, is a particular thing, namely this thing. Check it out. With just a little bit of care and attention, I can go boop. Yay, got the chat. I'm not sure if I should say yay so quickly. It might be anything but a yay in the long run. We'll see. But, hey, so here we are. Welcome to the Air Windows Monday chat, and I will be answering questions as always. For the time being, unless we hit a much higher Patreon goal, it's going to be 2 hours. I kept hammering away at my morning until the time of the streaming, so most likely once I'm finished doing this, I am going to go and crash. But until that time, we have chat. And it'll be... I'm going to have to hide some of this silliness. All of YouTube's foolishness. What can I switch to? Maybe I'm going to want to look at my GitHub, in which case I should go there. I could go to the Ko-fi. That's an interesting thing. I think I mentioned in my most recent plugin update that there's this thing that they call Ko-fi, and it's possibly an alternate thing to Patreon. Maybe I should switch out of Top Chat just for seeing if there's anybody here. I've never had a situation where nobody showed up, but we'll see. Switch over to the plugins in case I need to look up anybody's stuff. Yeah, here's the thing, is I am in the process of doing the floating point dithering, and I think it is possible for me to incorporate the random source that I get from that into what I'm using for the denormalization. And I'm exploring some ideas on that, so I could end up with a really ginormous update in the long run. Oh, hello. I think maybe give me a second. I have to go and get a paper towel because I'm fooling around with ink and stuff and just spilled some. We'll fix that in a jiffy. Oh. There are 2 jiffies and a wink. Hey, Miguel. How's it going? So this is the Air Windows live stream in a particularly wacky form, because what you caught me doing is something that is not specifically plugin related. I'll tell you about it, but it'll be a sort of amusing side issue, because here's the thing. I do other stuff sometimes, and among those other things are attempts at doing art. And so I have spent some time doing stuff like learning how to do ink wash and watercolor and so on. And that's not technically super related to making plugins. I mean, I suppose I could be painting watercolored interfaces and learning how to do GUI and making all the VSDs be watercolor plugins. That'd be weird. It'd be gray things that look like this. But also what I'm doing is just kind of learning how to work those media, because I've always done other things as well as simply doing software. So this current experiment was, can I make this large brush, which originally contained ink wash, be something that I could maybe paint large areas with, if not dark colors. I had it trying to make it be a black marker, except for it's a brush. And that didn't actually work. So I tried washing it out and got my hands, I washed them, but I got my hands all dirty with ink wash and attempted to rinse it out so that this would be a clear water brush. And as you can see, it's not even remotely clear water. So what I'm doing is just fooling around and seeing what this is at this point. It could be trash. I might just throw it away if it is that ruined by the experiments I've tried to do. But again, this is very sort of Chris from Air Windowsy type stuff. This going like, here is a container that is meant to use water for watercolor, where you just squeeze it a little bit and more water comes out. What would happen if I put ink in here? Or what would happen if I put diluted watercolor paint? Or if you like drawing with pencils, there are some pretty cool pencil-y type things that come in different hardnesses called Derwent Graphitone. And that is water-soluble graphite, which I believe is what's in here too. It just doesn't look anything like it. And my trouble with this particular brush, I'm going to peek and see whether I got anybody else. We got about 8 people here, which is fine. The thing about this particular brush is it's extremely unmanageable. it like flops over this way, and then it'll flop over that way, and you can get a lot of liquid through by squeezing, but then it just dumps a bunch of the whatever is in here. And I've tried to make it be a sort of solid ink wash. Also, if you scrub it around, you can have bits of the bristles all coming loose and stuff. It's just a bit of a big mess. Like, it's not very good at doing large scale things. Maybe it'll be it's like Sumi-E type deal. Sumi-E is, of course, the Japanese painting style where you use a ginormous brush and just sort of straight black ink, and typically a vertical hold on things, and make these pictures that are sort of brush strokes like that, where you're going down harder on them sometimes. But this isn't really very good at that because it doesn't have the fine tip. And if you push it down, it doesn't really go to the full width. This looks like it should go to a really wide stroke, but it just won't. You push it harder and it about goes this far, and that's about all there is. Be warned, I might continue talking about brushes and ink until somebody asks a plugin question, because that's really what I'm here for, and I've got the Mac AU repository and GitHub right in front of me, and am more than prepared to jump into that. So people think like, oh, we better only talk about ink. What do I know about ink? Nothing. Okay, then. Don't be confused. Don't be confused. I just gotta keep my interest up, and this is something that I was doing before I fired up the live stream. Honestly, I wonder if this is going to be some kind of stream where people don't know what to say or aren't showing up and asking stuff, or stressed out by other things. Lord knows I've been a little stressed out by the events of the last day or so. If anybody, oh, look, there I go, putting another splotch of ink in there. I spent like 15 minutes washing this out and trying to make it do clear water, which is clearly not working. So that's amusing. But yeah, for those who are watching this in playback, and I'm still a little fussed as to why on earth is yeah, I should be like roll call. People start saying things in the chat. Like I'll go test. Hey, okay, so now I know that that is working. It didn't just die on me randomly. So yeah, apparently this is a failed Sumi-E brush that is useless. Cool, whatever. Because it has this enormous body of the brush that makes it unmanageable, but at the same time you can't do variations in the thickness of it, and it's just, yeah, it's crud. It's crud. I'm not worried about that. The pieces of paper that I have here are stuff that I cut out because I thought maybe what I could do is like paint little bitty album covers and then scan them in and use them for something. But I haven't really been getting around to that very effectively. Like, this is a weird abstraction, kind of nothing more. I got a nice little stack of those, but it's one of those things where I need to get to a point of, I don't know, having the ideas or having the motivation and wanting to do something about it. So yeah, if you are tuning in on playback in some way, or it went to YouTube, this is Monday, March 25th of 2019, and this is just after the country that I live in, the United States, kind of went bonkers in a variety of different ways, because a guy who is supposed to analyze things about politics named Mueller coughed up a report which another guy who was appointed by sort of the defendant of stuff that was going on refused to say anything out of it other than a few excerpts from sentences and not even a whole sentence, at which point the entire media started behaving as if that was the full report and they had been given all of the information they needed. So yeah, things are kind of crazy, and I would not be surprised if there are people who are just a little stressed and not getting involved with the plugin chat today. You know, it's fine. It's like these are things that we kind of have to ride out from time to time. It's not in my power to change those things, or I would have. So the most recent plugin that I did, Low Pass 2, is a plugin that has it's taken an earlier plugin called Low Pass, and I've altered it in a number of different ways. Low Pass itself was doing a thing where it was tracking the sample rate so that it could try to go to the same frequency no matter what sample rate you were using. Unfortunately, that meant that it was tied to only the sample rate available on 44.1K. And that meant that if you were using a higher sample rate, it would refuse to go above roughly 20K or so, if that. And because of the way the filter was designed, it wouldn't open up completely. So since it wasn't itself a steep Brickwall filter, it would go from, at 44.1K, you could open it up completely and get the full range. And then at anything else, you'd start getting complete roll-off because the roll-off was so slow. And the stuff that I changed was about, firstly, fixing that. Now what Low Pass 2 does is Low Pass 2 lets you have the full range from silence to wide open across the way the control works. So if you're running something at very, very high frequency, like 192K or something, what you'll get is a large range of the adjustment where it's still operating at supersonic frequencies, and you might not hear much of a difference. But it's necessary in order to be able to open it up completely and have all the high frequencies coming through. But the other thing that I did was give it the same kind of multiple dry-wet stages that I have in Holt and that I have in Grooveware and Crunchy Grooveware, where you get to use only one stage and skip all the other stages. In other words, if you set it from 0 to 1, you're going from dry to the first stage. And if you set it from 1 to 2, this poles control, it's going from the single stage and the second stage being fully dry, only the first, to first stage and part of the second, to first stage and all of the second, and so on and so forth. Like it'll extend outwards to be... And the reason I'm doing it this way is because you can do stuff like an overall dry wet. In fact, I did for Low Pass 2. But if you're running like 4 stages of some kind of processing, that's kind of a lot of processing. And maybe if you wanted a subtler effect, you want to not run through as many stages of the processing. So this dry wet configuration lets you bring in only a certain amount. And for the other sections that aren't part of it, you never even do the calculations that they relate to. Instead, you're simply applying only as much as you need. With the filter, this also applies a varying slope to the filter. Like what you get, I can whip out my, oh, for heaven's sake. I can whip out my pen and then immediately drop the cap on the floor. Where'd that go? Just a moment. Okay, let's try to find this again. Ta-da! Haha, I got the cap. So, here is how the variable slope thing works on low pass 2. An interesting side note, you'll notice that all this fooling around with the brush that I was trying to wash out so that it was clear ink, and this is what it would produce. If I use this Tombow ABT pen, which is supposed to be black, well, the darkness of this black is not that different from the darkness of heavily washed out brush pen. If you want to make something very, very black, you maybe have to do multiple layers of that, and even that will only take you so far. And I would compare that to using plugins, because a lot of the times when we're using plugins, what we're trying to do is like painting with dirty water. If the quality of the plugin is not good enough, then it's going to fail to produce the color you're trying to create because of technical limitations. And I work against having that problem. So if you have a single pole of low pass, it might roll off kind of like this. Whereas if you have 2 poles, it could be rolling off faster. Or 3 or 4 poles, you could have it rolling off faster still. Although my low pass has a weirdness in that it has a it's got interleaved IIR filters. Like it's 2 entirely separate low pass filters that are oscillating back and forth with each sample. Because the way I look at samples is there is no such thing as a single sample as a piece of data. It's always combinations of samples showing where the output audio would go. And for that reason, I like doing the interleaving thing. And that causes this effect up at the Nyquist frequency, which I can draw here, where you start getting information trying to creep through, because as you put audio content in there, and it is fixable, I could average the last 2 points, although I would lose the highs at that point. Like this is a situation where I can crank it up all the way and get full range signal through. Using these multiple stages lets you get steeper filters at the cost of running into other issues. For instance, one design that I've had in the past that here, I'll do another figure for this. I have done a high-pass filter. In fact, it was in one of the 2 vinyl filters, and people basically made me alter it because it was changing stuff for them, although I could look into using this for other things. I had a high pass which overshot like that. You'd be rolling off the bass, but as you reached this point, the amplitude would go up until it started going down very quickly. And this was without me programming in a resonant feature. Instead, what was happening was basically this. I was keeping a temporary variable. So I was going like IIR. I'm not going to try to write the code. My head is not going to be down with that today. But the guts of what I was doing there that caused that result was that I was keeping a temporary variable and tracking this increasingly steep IIR filter as it kept going and affecting only the temporary variable instead, and keeping track of how far away that went from the original source. And once I finished doing that, I made a note of how far that had been and then applied it directly to the original source in one math operation. And the idea with that was to retain more of the original source rather than putting it through these many multiplications, these many polls. Sometimes I like doing 26 polls because I can name them A to Z, and for whatever reason that just makes sense to me. Like I can see the code as it's being written and go like, okay, here's this poll, here's this poll, here, and there are other ways to do it, but I'm known for picking some unusual or weird ways of doing things sometimes. My hope is that when I do stuff like that, it might be more communicable to people who don't know that much about programming. Because one of the challenges of programming is that programmers take these kinds of things and make them be more abstract. Like you've got your program code there, and the programmer will be like, okay, everything that you're doing here is contained within this black box with these inputs and this output, and this is how you talk to the black box. And oh, by the way, the stuff that you're doing, which includes this box, is itself in another black box. And so they wind up with these great abstractions. And you have code that looks like this kind of thing, where, you know, this calls this to do what it does, which calls this to do what it does. So the whole thing could be written out in long form, and it would take more what you might think of sentences. But it's using these abstractions in such a way that any given piece of what's being done is just like two words, this tiny little piece of stuff that can be very simple, but you're expected to keep track of all the abstraction. Like the way that, you know, what it doesn't show is that, you know, this thing calls this, which calls this, and it gets this information from over here and stuff, and they're writing out the words, but you're expected to understand all of this going back and forth, the way where it gets its information, and that's never shown. That is hidden, and it's a kind of structured programming that assumes that you're going to be able to keep track of however big of a stack it is, telling you what went where to do what and where it got its information and how that worked. And the idea is this is all very obvious and direct because you spell it out in that way. You say, you know, this is that and thus and so. But when there's like hundreds of thousands of words in a program, it's slow and cumbersome to read through. But when there's hundreds of words in a configuration like this, where you're saving thousands of words by just making it be these abstractions that call upon each other, then you're having to remember hundreds of redirections and ways in which it gets its information, and it can be completely daunting looking at stuff like that and going, where is this getting its information? Where does the information go in? Where does the information come out? It seems to be just a pile of stuff that's calling each other, and it's all very abstract, and all the individual pieces seem far too small to do anything. So these are the ways in which coding can be challenging and difficult. So let me take a peek over on live dashboard again. So people wander in and out, which is absolutely fine. I assume the announcement went out, and I've been going for about a half an hour. So here's my question. You can see my live chat here. Yeah. It is like a flowchart to the most extreme degree. So what I'm going to ask is, do you have any questions for me on this live stream? Because I'm here to talk to people who are in the chat. I'm not here to just monologue. And if I've got stuff that I can talk about or people asking stuff, then we can do our usual 2 hours of, live chat and all that kind of thing. But I'm here for you. You're not here just to have me talk at you. So I'm going to sit for a bit and maybe take this silly failure of a pen. Hey, Marwin. I realize that it's a long latency and delay. And I'll maybe paint a little album cover or something and wait for people to ask a question. Because that's kind of what I need from you, is interaction. You could ask me what I'm working on. That might be fruitful. I can tell you some things about that. For instance, have you ever heard of a plugin called Smooth? That could prove an interesting question. How did it get started? First plugin is what you mean. I won't tease you about that. So, I got started in programming when I was a kid, which, as you might imagine, is a terribly long time ago. In fact, I got started in programming before my corporate computer programmer brother did. Because when I was a kid, we had a Apple II Plus computer. That's right, I'm so old that I was around when the Atari came out. I was around when the Apple came out, the first personal computers people had. And, my dad was a big computer nerd before there was such a thing, and so we bought one. And I started trying to make programs in BASIC, AppleSoft BASIC. I think we did that much in Integer BASIC. AppleSoft BASIC was the version of BASIC that had floating point numbers. Integer BASIC did not have floating point numbers, hence the name. And I was doing GUI before there was such a thing, kind of, because I did stuff with the HDR screen and the GR screen, like games, like having a little red dot going upwards through a path and claiming that that path was a road, making it move around and stuff, and interesting, if you're not familiar with that kind of stuff, it might be amusing to you to hear what that contained. Like when I say graphics, what I mean is that HGR was 279 by 179 pixels. That was it. The full screen was that big. I think there's a bunch of icons these days that aren't as big as that. And that was the high res. That was HGR. GR was 39 by 39, if I remember correctly. I think it might have used 0. It might have been 0 to 39. So I started programming on that platform. And then when I went to college. I got into music. I learned things about audio. I built a lot of hardware. Altered and modified my own tube amplifiers. This was back in college. This was a long time ago. And just worked. I got into a band. I played rock music with the band that I was in. And that was so distracting that I wandered away from programming for a while. But then, I went through a rough period. I wasn't behaving very well at this time. I was on drugs. I hate to say the don't do drugs are bad, kid MK, but, I did a lot of experimenting at that time, but it didn't wind up working out well for me. In fact, I winded up having to stop using drugs because I was too hung up on them, and everything had to be about the drugs, and it got to the point where it was exhausting and just pretty much of a disaster. Look, here's a little ocean scene. Or something. And that led me through a bunch of difficult places to where, I became homeless and had to get clean, not in that order. First thing I did was get clean, and then the rest of my life fell apart to the point where I had to go looking for some services and things. And I got brought into this thing that was called the Shelter Plus Care program because they looked at me and they were like, this is not a normal homeless person. This person seems to be smart, but there's something wrong with them. And, they got me therapy and they got me off the street. Not that I was ever really on the street. I went to a shelter almost immediately from losing my place to be. And it was in this therapy stuff that was very much social services, very much kind of, it was in Vermont, and was the kind of stuff that you go through when you are completely poverty-stricken and have nothing going on. I fell into that world, and the end result of it was I learned I had autism, and there were reasons why I was the way that I was. It wasn't just that I was bad or broken or something. There were specifics. Furthermore, they were things that it was expected that I would deal with this kind of stuff and get better. And since I was in recovery and not using drugs, it sounded good to me. I was like, okay, so my life has more of a reason and purpose than I thought. And there is a explanation for some of these challenges that I'm getting. What can I do with myself? And I ended up going on, or I didn't end up because I'm still here, I didn't end, but I went on Social Security disability for a time. And one of the things that they did there was work out, okay, you're going on disability. At what point did this condition of yours begin? And they were like, wow, okay, so that's about as many years back as we can calculate. So we can go this many years back, so we owe you a bunch of retroactive, so here. And I ended up plunking into a place to live, and with money in the bank, in a situation where, since these circumstances, I'm going to get to some of these questions. I'm glad people are asking them. It helps things move along. I'm just finishing the rather long, the how did you get started, it's turned into my life story, because it's leading up to what you were asking about. I was in a situation where I was surviving on disability and had been given this retroactive payment, and the way they set that stuff up, you'll end up back out in the street if you have money in the bank, because they'll give you a pile of money. These days they don't do that quite as literally, at least not in Vermont. Not quite that way. But they'll give you a big pile of money, and then they'll turn around and go, oh, you have a big pile of money, therefore you don't have any problems. Be gone with you. And you lose everything that you had as far as structure in your life. So I was required to burn through all of this money that I had and spend it on something, which was, of course, a computer. In fact, it was a Apple Performa 575 computer, which I believe I still have in my basement, although I don't think it's been working for some time. And I spent a bunch of time derping around with that. That was a 33 megahertz machine with 48 megs of RAM. Or I think maybe it ended up in 48 megs of RAM, and it started out with 16 megs of RAM. And that's what I started doing stuff on, because I started with a software development system called Real Basic, which, since it was apparently a kind of basic, it seemed like I should be able to do something with it. And in fact, I did make a bunch of programs using this, one of which was the program called Mastering Tools. I was going to do audio mastering. That never became a thing. Like I promised, I never did serious mastering as work. But Mastering Tools also had displays because I needed to show how loud stuff was. And I was very interested in the loudness war even back then. And that produced the graphs and things that gave me the study that ended up getting into the New York Times in the last few months. I forget exactly when that ran, but it was fairly recently. So yeah, a formerly homeless person on SSI disability did the initial work that ended up getting this guy an op-ed in the New York Times and people talking about it, and me being quoted in the same article as Bob Ludwig. And they asked, do you want to be listed as a mastering engineer? And I was like, no, because I've not done that as a job. But the ideas were still valid, and I think it's interesting that work that ended up getting, a pretty reasonable amount of mileage. Somebody else had to do the legwork of writing the article and getting that ready. But that work was being done by essentially a homeless person on disability who couldn't work for a living. That's where that came from. So that contextualizes it a little bit. And bear in mind how many people could be out there under similar circumstances. Maybe they're doing equally interesting things or thinking equally interesting thoughts. The question becomes, will you hear from them? Like you were able to hear from me because I was able to survive for like 20 more years, to the point where I was engaging with the world in a more constructive way, and people remembered that information, and I'd had that information for some time because I was doing that work, way back when. And the actual plugin programming came through me needing to start doing stuff that worked in digital audio workstations. And my stuff did not, like Real Basic programs don't do that. So I needed to come up with something else that would. And gradually I got together an audio unit template that could build into something. And what I needed, and this continues to be the case with anything else that I do, is I need a working template where there's something I basically understand that can be compiled together to do the thing. Because I usually can't go through all of the details like I'm going to build an interface system and host plugins myself. I will write the thing that hosts all these different plugins. I can't do that. That is a level of sophistication that is huge relative to thinking of just samples and how samples can interact with each other. and what you can do with those. So I stick with the DSP, and there's not enough room in my head for becoming a systems programmer at the same time. So the plug-in programming came because it had to, and it was all about getting that first audio unit build to work. And once I had that, it was running all the variations on how to make things sound differently. And of course, I'd been doing that all my life. So that became pretty direct. It's the same deal with doing the VSTs. Like, I started doing VSTs when I finally was able to get a build together that would work. And my brother, who's been a Windows programmer for years, was able to get the Windows build together. And so I would be using that. And then I didn't have the Linux because neither me nor my brother knew how to do it until actually a hacker in Russia came up with a script, because he knew how to build the things in Linux and make them into those little object files that they have. And since he's an open source guy, it didn't matter where he lived or whatever, he just knew how to do the thing. And he was like, here, and he gave me the script, and it was a real script, and that's what I've been using ever since. So it's about being able to get over the blocks of the stuff that I don't know and work on the stuff that I do know. That is as much of the answering about how did I learn to program as I'm going to do for the time being. Although if anybody has more specific questions about that, then fire them off and I'll get to them. And as far as how long did it take you? Boy, okay, so years. But once I had the first one done, I could do the second one and so on. How was my last 2 weeks? Well, some of these plugins have been good, And it's getting warmer outside, and that's nice. So it's all right. It's reasonably fine. Software synth. I'm not currently in a place of doing a software synth, but I'm more likely to do a hardware synth. Actually, I'm more likely to do a Eurorack synth. Like, as you can see, my progress on these things continues to develop, because now I've decided that I want to make 3 of these little guys, the sequencer thing that I was doing. I'm going to need to get 3 power cables. Power cables for Eurorack are these little ribbon cables, and they might cost like, I don't know, $3, $5 something. So right now I can't afford to get any of them, but I need to get 3 more of them. And when I can do that, I can start building that stuff together. So the challenges of making a soft synth is that you're also incorporating all of that MIDI stuff. And another challenge is that I have been kind of fixated on wanting to release an audio unit and VST both, because Logic doesn't run VSTs all by itself. And there's a bunch of other Mac applications that can take audio units and don't necessarily take VSTs, because Apple doesn't want you to. So there's that. It's awkward. I mean, if I was to switch over to VST entirely, that could be a thing, and then there would be abandoning entire platforms. But as far as making a soft synth, it's not so dissimilar to making the GUI plugins, in that the audio unit way of doing that and the VST way of doing that can be strikingly different. So you're having to master entirely 2 different things, and, being the plugin world being what it is, people like the guy that helped me put together the Linux script are rare and far between. I mean, I can shout out a couple of them, like Sophia Poirier from Destroy Effects, helped me out early on. Zaphod, Giancarlo, the Nebula guy, actually answered some questions for me and helped me. And he is one of the very few. And mostly people are so busy trying to compete and fight with each other that they will not help you. To the extent that I can contrast from that, I can and will. But it's pretty disheartening the way, like normally with programming, you will see programmers interacting and helping each other. But when it comes down to plugins and making stuff for musicians, it's like all of that goes by the by. And people are just in this survival mode. They have to make more money. And they have to have their enemies not make any money because it's a limited pool of, it's just a pile of nonsense. This is not the way that society is supposed to work. But the challenges of making the soft synth for me are in part just coming up with the new design. I have looked over audio unit soft synths, and it didn't get all that super, it didn't click for me. Not yet. And when it does, it also becomes a question of what am I going to do? For instance, I have some of the Native Instruments stuff. I don't use it on a day-to-day basis now because I've got my regular synths and I like using an analog studio. But I do have Native Instruments Massive and FM8, which is, I rather prefer that to Massive actually. And what would I do in a soft synth to be so much better than that? There's if you're on Windows, you can apparently get the synthesizer that Deadmau5 likes using for his soft synth type stuff. I think he has a special version of it that runs in a big Uber computer, and it's just incredibly oversampling or whatever it is that it does. But you can get that one, meaning that you can get your oscillators and things in a very high quality form. And it becomes a matter of, what more will you do? So I wouldn't rule that out, but it's not happening this week. I know that. Is there a difference between clipping and Brickwall limiting? Absolutely. The difference between clipping and Brickwall limiting is that with clipping, you're flat topping the wave, and with Brickwall limiting, often you've got a look ahead. And what you're doing is cutting back, clipping is the flat top. That's not a very good flat top, but we'll just assume that it's going to be like that. Whereas look ahead would be turning it down before it hits there so that you still have the shape of the top. Unfortunately, what happens there is, say you got a waveform that's like that. What will happen is you'll go up like this, and then a crude example of that is the waveform goes up, and then the look at says, oh, you're going to hit this, so therefore let's turn this down so that you can go up there more smoothly. Well, the turning down also has its artifact, and that's out of nowhere. That's not part of the original wave. So limiting can have issues. There's a limit to how fast you can put in a gain correction to compensate for something like that. And all look ahead does is put in that gain correction at a place that's not even related to the peak. You're putting in the gain correction somewhere else, and which is not great. I tend to favor clippers for that reason. It's just a little bit more coherent, having stuff directly clip or directly saturate, rather than having these gain changes come in places where they don't belong. Granted, if you're in silence, you won't notice it, but how often is the audio purely just silence before a loud noise? Often you're going to have sound and then a loud noise. So the question is kind of worn out. Let's see how we're doing. I'll be catching up with these. Laptop making. Do I recommend a overpriced but stable Mac Pro or rather an inexpensive PC? Yeah, no, you could, if you enjoy Macs, which I do, you could look at the new Mac Mini, because the new Mac Mini runs faster than the Mac Pro. Go figure. I'm not making that up. It has other limitations, like, you're not going to get as big of a GPU in it or whatever. You can get external ones, mind you. But the newest Mac Mini runs faster than the previous generation Mac Pro. That's just, Moore's Law for you. It's computers getting better bit by bit. And it makes sense that something like, a Mac Mini, which is a one-piece thing. It's designed with its RAM or whatever built into it, and it's all just sort of designed in one chunk. And they have the money and resources to do that effectively. It kind of stands to reason that they'd be able to make it be more efficient at the main things that it does. So, you're talking about laptops, however, so I skipped that. So what you're talking about is a MacBook Pro, presumably. I don't know. I think it depends. I think it depends upon what you're used to. And there is a degree of concerns about stability, which aren't always a panacea for the Mac side of things. Like in the machine that I'm streaming through. On this machine, I have these headphones on, but the Mac operating system is randomly turning down one side of the headphones from time to time when I least expect it. Not when I'm using them, but it switches back over to the headphones, and periodically it'll be like, oh, that went away. And I'll have to go back into audio MIDI setup to fix it. So, but the underlying Mac OS core audio infrastructure is pretty stable and reliable on the whole. So as far as, I really couldn't tell you. I mean, you could get a PC and just kind of try to make a point of finding one that would also work for a Linux in case you needed to go there, because one of the problems with going with Windows is kind of the problem with going with Chrome as a web browser, which everybody does these days statistically, is that they will change things on you if they want. And they'll change stuff out from under you, and that means they can just hose you without asking and without particularly caring. Like you were part of this sea of users in which they swim. And these companies that are like, oh, here, let's change this, let's do that, especially if they're trying to move you on to a newer machine or a newer operating system or a newer this or a newer that, it gets kind of messy. And, that has stopped me from going beyond like Windows 7 for the Windows plugin developing that I do. I do that in a virtual machine, and I keep it sort of isolated from everything because I don't trust it not to update itself out from under me to a non-working state. And of course, Linux, you're required usually to do your own updating, and it is just the same possibility of stuff getting really broken. You'd be wanting to stick on stable builds for that. And with the Mac, usually stuff behaves itself and stays more reliable, but you can't be absolutely certain of that either. So I don't know. Recommendations, it's like, what are you most comfortable with? I'll try to support you whatever basic platform you're on, but you kind of got to pick your poison. The difference between clippers and limiters, Bernie, is that clippers directly stop the waveform from going any further, whereas limiters try to turn it down so that you can keep having the shape of the waveform rather than just lopping off everything past a certain point. Which is relevant because if you have a waveform that is wiggly and has spikes in it, like a cymbal crash, if you just chop it off, all of these peaks go away and become just flat at that point. Whereas if you limited it, you would have that same shape. And it wouldn't lop it off. Or for instance, if the whole entire thing got lopped off here, and it was going up to here, and then this was where the clipping was, all of this information just plain goes away until it comes back. So you have high frequency stuff, and then all of a sudden the high frequency stuff is gone because you're just clipping. And then you come back and you start to get it back. So that's one reason why clipping isn't always great. Mind you, if you're soft clipping, it squishes the high frequency stuff in. But there's a distinct difference between clipping and limiting as far as that is concerned. You know, I won't say I haven't explored limiter things. I think I have a peak limiter coming at some point. I just was never very happy with it because I was putting it up against stuff like L2 and didn't really like how that worked. In fact, you can use Block Party as a limiter-like behavior. See whether that works for you, because that is not a look. It's not a look-ahead design, but it's a kind of compressy type thing where you can hit it good and hard, and it'll flatten stuff out in that way, but it'll keep some of the range so you can still have high-frequency fluctuations going on. So shorten the plugin list. Oh, shortening the plugin list is heresy, sir. How could you do that? I have sometimes combined plugins into other plugins. That's where C-Strip came from. C-Strip is a plugin that is literally EQ plus Buttercomp plus a variety of other things. They're not my favorite thing because I feel you should be able to swap out chunks of those for other things. And if you're going to swap out chunks of plugins for other plugins, why shouldn't you just do those in the, you know, the bin where you put the plugins in on your channels or your buses or whatever? Like especially with the dithering to floating point and stuff like that, I don't feel that there is that much of a handicap to using a lot of different plugins, each of which does their own little thing. And certainly the last thing I want to do is shorten the plugin list. Good God, sir. Shocked I am. It becomes a separate question of how do I guide people to the correct plugins, and of course that's part of what this live stream is. Pedro asks, do I program in Juice? No, I don't understand Juice. Juice, to me, is a very ambitious thing, but it's completely daunting. Like, I can't figure out where it's coming from. There is so much to it, and there's so much abstraction and things that you have to know about, and so much of that stuff that it's doing seems just mysterious. I have all the respect in the world for the way that it's cross-compiling to all these different platforms, and that's amazing. And yet the complexity of it daunts me completely. I can't even begin to face it. Maybe that will change someday, but for the time being, every time I've looked at Juice, I came away completely baffled. I wouldn't even know how to tell it to build. Maybe that's one of those things where, like, since I know it is very popular and very well supported, although I'm not happy with platform limitations. Like, if I was to do VST GUI plugins, I would want it to target the same platforms I target with the generic stuff. And that is back to 10.6.8 on the Mac. That is back to the PowerPC on the Mac. That is back to Windows 7 or earlier. I'm not sure how much earlier. But the whole point of what I'm doing is to let people use this wide range of machines and not choose some kind of middleware platform like Juice that will require people to upgrade their computers and use the latest of this and that and so on. You know, getting tied into stuff like that is anathema to me. I don't like it. So I'm going to try to be supporting a wider range of stuff. Let's see. What developers are making hardware synths that interest you outside Eurorack? Well, that's an interesting caveat there. Because some of the ones that I use, like, I can outline what I use around here. I got a Rhodes, that's not a synth, that is an electric piano. I have Zox boxes, which I made myself. I built them out of the... I'm trying to remember who was providing them. I don't think it was Mode Machine specifically. But one of the people that provide Zoxbox kits, I built Zoxboxes, and I've got 2 of them like that. The Farfisa is not a synthesizer. It's another sort of electric-style keyboard. It's a classic organ kind of thing. The Roland Alpha Junos are analog synthesizers, and I think they sound special. Some people don't like them all that much. You compare them to like older Rolands, and the older ones have their own tone quality, but the Junos have some nifty capacities. They're capable of making some very striking sounds. I've got a Yamaha FB01 that is a very cheap synthesizer. It's a 4-operator FM synthesizer. So, you know, if we're talking about synths and you say outside Eurorack, that limits me enormously, because what I'm really interested in is replicating some of this stuff inside Eurorack. So there is a company making a synthesizer inside Eurorack called Takemi's Castle, which is a FM synthesizer. And that is interesting to me. There is, let's see, I've got in the rack, there's the Moogs, there's the Behringer. You keep an eye on Behringer because they can sometimes make very good sounding stuff. It's not necessarily, you know, a morally great choice, because they also tend to rip people off, but they are able to put out good sounding stuff at times, and they are specialists in putting out really cheap things. Underneath there's a Kurzweil. That's a lovely giant purple elephant, this thing. It is a K2600. I'm sure it used to cost like $10,000. Currently, it's like a $200 white elephant. And then I've got controllers up here. And assorted little things kicking around, including I want to build stuff of my own. So when it comes down to making hardware synths, you know, including outside Eurorack, I should mention, in my Eurorack stuff, I do have 2 Bastel Castles that are built into a panel, so that I can plug Eurorack cables into them in various places. And I think that's probably the single most strong answer I can give you, which is, you know, what developers are making hardware synths that interest you outside Eurorack? Bastel. Bastel are making a bunch of stuff that's often wired using those tiny little jumper cables, and they've made some amazing things that sort of just sit on your desktop and make weird noises. Now, let me see. I'll get to all of these. You know, thanks for the good wishes with the Eurorack stuff. I can't wait to hear how it all sounds either. You know, how it all sounds too. And so Octopus has a number of comments I'm going to talk about. How would you use Desk 4 to work with Console 5? Here's what I would do. Like the original version of Console 4 was capable of being adapted in such a way that you could put other plugins in place of the channel plugins. That is not so much the case with Console 5. Console 5 has a encode decode thing that's very accurate. And particularly if you're using Purist Console 5, or I think that's the way that Purist Console. That's the one that is just stripped down to only that mechanism. And if you needed to use Desk 4, what I would suggest is, if you want the tone of Desk 4 rather than the tone of something like one of the variations on Console 5, like, PD Console or something, I would use Purist Console and then run Desk in front of the channel plugin. And you could also run Desk after the bus decode plugin. You'd kind of want to keep it out of the middle of there. It's doable, but it also would change the way that the summing works. But you can use Desk 4 as just plain coloring. You can use it to just set up tones and apply some of these things like the treble soak that it's got in there, which is a distinct algorithm that I don't think any of the other plugins has, you could just put that in as a tone shaper. And if you want the console 5 to behave very consistently, you don't stick things between the two console plugins. You let it do its summing. But you can use either Desks 4 or, say, Bus Colors 4 as strictly a tone colorer. And just sort of gain stage it, get it doing the right levels of distorting, do the right levels of treble soaking or whatever. Manipulate it in that way. And consider it to be kind of like an EQ. Consider it to be kind of like a tone color. That is what you should do if you're trying to combine the two. Because console 5 channels are not so easily replaced with these tone color things. And that's not to say that I won't come up with additional ways to incorporate console 5. Now that I've got that neat encode-decode pair that does such an accurate job, and granted I've tried to also use it on slew, and that ended up producing DC offset sometimes, so there's still stuff to be learned. But it's probably possible to incorporate some other stuff, and you might see that coming out. Like, for instance, what would you think of a learning? One of the things about, say, Bus Colors is that Bus Colors uses multiple impulses to simulate the tone of hardware equipment based on the impulse response from that equipment at multiple amplitudes. So it changes based on how loud it is. And the original character plugins use that in a distinct way that wasn't necessarily the case otherwise. Well, you could potentially see me finding a way to combine that as part of the, like applying a particular convolution as you encode and then going through the bus, mixing things together, and then applying a different kind of convolution for the decode that applies the alteration of tone that console does, but as a impulse based off of actual hardware. And then the point becomes, how do I come up with, what combination of different impulses at different levels? Like, how do you depict what the difference is between the one impulse and the other impulse based on whether it's pushing the console harder or not as hard? And how do you apply that to the combination? Like, if I can pull that one off, it'll be mind-blowing. That's the kind of thing that would really work and would do a very interesting thing that you wouldn't get elsewhere. That said, I don't have it on the top of my... I don't quite know how to do that. Yeah, Eurorack version of... Yeah, well, that's what I was telling you. There's a company that makes a Eurorack module called Akimi's Castle, and also something or other is Tycho. And those are, I think, 4-operator FM synths based off of a chip that was used in video games and computers, if I'm not mistaken. And those are literally that. Those are literally the Eurorack version of the Yamaha FM synthesis. Which is, bear in mind you can have that, but that's not the only way of doing things. Have you ever heard of Casio's synthesis? Because here's the thing. You might think of Casio's as a bit of a joke. Like, you can get really cheap Casio tones that have incredibly cheesy sounds. Often they're made through FM synthesis themselves, so they can be kind of neat, but they're also incredibly cheesy. But back in the day, Casio did make some straight-up synthesizers. I think they still had a bunch of presets, and they never did like a proper Moog or anything like that, but they did put out some Casio, I think they were a CZ series synthesizers, and those used a different technique entirely, which I can show you a little bit of how that works. I'm not at the stage of actually making plugins to do this, but technically at some point maybe I could. We'll see whether I get there. Like say you have waveforms, and FM synthesis bases things off of adding different waveforms, either amplitude modulation like this, or frequency modulation like this. This is a waveform that's being frequency modulated. It's going faster here, and then it slows down, and then it goes fast again. And you can apply a lot of different stuff like that. For instance, you can apply frequency modulation to a waveform to make a weird alternate waveform kind of like that. And you're adding harmonics, and you're frequency modulating it so that it goes up faster, and then does stuff around the top, and then goes down through this other part faster. You know, the frequency modulation is accelerating at these points, making it do different things. What Casio did was quite different. They were doing a thing where you would have your waveform, and then you would add, say, a harmonic or a resonance or something like that, that was just like combining it with some kind of other thing to the point where it might just sort of clash. Like you'd need to do a different one, and if it started at the different waveform beginnings, you'd have these overtones that would be related. They'd start at the beginning of the waveform. They'd start at these points. But then they wouldn't necessarily sync up. So if you didn't do anything about that, you would have a click at the end of the wave as it switched from one point to the other point. And it would be like, zoop. It would click through those points and begin again. So what Casio did was this. They would do their waveform, like so, and go, okay, so we're going to start, I'm going to do half waveforms just that it's easier to see. And you'd start at each of these points. So they would add their weird carrier tone, like a resonance, right? And then for every waveform, they would fade it back until it merged perfectly with the other waveform coming in. So Casio had this form of synthesis that was digital synthesis, but it sounded different than other digital synthesis because it was using different rules. That's what the Casio CZ synthesizers did. And what you'll find is that if you find these Casios out there in the wild being used, you'll find them in, say, actually, no, I'll type it because you can see it in the chat more easily than if I try to write it out longhand. This is a band, Carbon-Based Lifeforms, that does this very ambient, chilled out music, but they make heavy use of these Casio synthesizers. And you can recognize the sound of the synthesizers by how intensely warm and solid and bassy and organic they sound. Like these particular Casios have an amazing quality for seeming like physical and enveloping, and they don't sound particularly digital at all. Although the way they're getting the sounds is this unusual way of doing it, where the resonant peaks that they throw in, for every bit of the waveform, it's just being faded down to nothing so that it can always merge smoothly with the next waveform coming in. And I have a album of theirs that I bought off of their Bandcamp thing. They'll sell you the high resolution stuff, Now, one thing I don't like about carbon-based life forms very much, yes, it is phase distortion modulation. That's the way they do it. One thing I'm not thrilled about carbon-based life forms is that they get into distortion sometimes on their tracks because they're these washes of ambient stuff, but they like pushing them really loud. So they will distort their stuff, and you can occasionally hear a crackling as some of those resonant things come through. I think that's on the actual recordings because I've looked at the raw, like directly off the CD or whatever, and it's definitely made to be super loud. And I'm sure I'm hearing some of that crackling and stuff going on. They pushed it as loud as they could, in other words. And sometimes that shows. But on the whole, I think it is wonderful soundscapes and stuff. And that particular quality of some of those tones is specifically Casio digital synthesizers. So go figure. That is another unusual synthesizer that is of some interest to me, although they're not currently making them. Currently, they're just using normal technologies for that kind of stuff. You can probably get plugins to do it as well. Now, Octopus on Fire. I know. I have the paypal.me/airwindows and things. I don't know why it says that. I don't know what I can do to look into it. This is one of the reasons that I favor Patreon. Granted, they have their ways of going about things, and granted that the head boss of Patreon is like, oh, this is not sustainable, even though they're in the black and taking in huge amounts of money. But Patreon is not giving me those problems, so I do still kind of favor it. And another possibility, Octopus, you might be interested in this. I'll just let me go and look this up so that I can do it properly. Mark Stillbar. Just a moment. And it's being annoying because it's asking me to send notifications, and like, no, you can't send notifications to me. I'm going to have to update this silly thing I have to pay Ko-fi money to have them do comparable things to what Patreon does, but I can at least direct you to something. So if you can't get any joy through PayPal, you can try that. I believe you can see that link. And I'm going to be working on this and trying to make it better. Currently, it's set up in such a way where it's like, it's in increments of $3. I'm going to make it so that it's more increments of being able to do a monthly thing, much like Patreon, and then being able to do things in increments of this much a month equals a plugin a year. Because that's the mode in which I'm doing things mostly. But this is all I've got other than the PayPal and the Patreon. So we will see how things work as far as that goes. In any case, yeah, you can, if you want, you can see if whether that works or not. It's not finished. I need to pay them actual money in order to be able to set things up in the way that I need. So I'm kind of trying to get ready for doing that. But I am kind of on giving you other alternatives. And that, as I think I said in the Ko-fi about section, is my emergency crash landing scenario for if Patreon goes boof, which I don't think they will because they're taking in too money. They were taking in too much money to go boof. They're taking in billions of dollars practically. And so they're like a PayPal. They're like an Amazon in their sector. So people saying that they're going to go poof is much like crazy investor talk, and it's a bunch of nonsense. But, a lot of nonsense has happened in the world in recent years, so I can't believe or trust anything, really. So we'll see whether we can't get Ko-fi up and working as a fallback position. Anyways. Yeah, and control schemes on synthesizers in general can be kind of overwhelming. So Styrian Goldings asks, why do you interleave some of your compressors in EQs? Well, I can tell you that. Because when you are making digital software and sampled the digital audio, what you'll get is these different little points. Like you got 0 here, and it'll give you this information of like, here's a dot here, here's a dot here, these are numbers. Are these where the audio goes? No, they are not. What the audio does is it weaves its way around this kind of stuff. Here, I'll try to highlight some of the places where it hits 0 again. So I'll take a moment and try to draw what this would look like. So the audio ends up doing something like this. And it's not a very good representation, but it's kind of like one. Or for instance, if you had like this pattern here, what it would do is really do a crazy slalom around these things without actually hitting them. Because the samples are not the audio. The audio gets reconstructed around the samples. The audio is what is left behind after you've used these as guidelines to reconstruct the changing waveform, which has to be a changing waveform that's capable of moving only so fast. It only gets to change so much. So we've done a terrible job of drawing that out. I won't show it to you again. But the idea, hopefully, is clear that those dots, which are samples, those are not the audio. The audio is drawing a waveform around the audio, meaning that any one given sample is not relevant to where the audio is going to be. Only combinations of 2 or more samples will give you what the actual signal is. Now, if I interleave things like compressors or EQs, what happens is that there are 2 distinct compressors or 2 distinct IIR filters, and they are reacting only to every other sample. So it's like the combination of the 2 has a different way of getting to what the ending sample is going to be. And here I can take another piece of paper and scribble out something else anyhow. Let's draw another set of samples. And one of the things that'll happen is like this. If you have this string of samples at the top, notice how they're all flat and that one of them is out of place. If you're interleaving, what will happen is that one of your playback things will remain completely untouched by the one that is out of place, and the other one will go and recover, go and capture it, and then come back. So interleaving is a way of being able to capture what I would call a smoother picture of some waveforms. You know, it'll do this small jitter right up at the very top, but it will also be more capable of ignoring isolated little elements that are a little bit out of place, because there'll be one of the IIRs or one of the FIRs that'll be not even part of the, getting hit by those things. And you can experiment with the sounds of this by comparing, say, any normal digital EQ, like in your DAW or whatever, with the Airwitness plugin capacitor. because capacitor does a multiple interleaving technique. Capacitor does a every other sample interleaving, and it does a every third sample interleaving, and it combines the two. So you have two poles, and one of the poles is interleaved, and one of the poles is like triple interleaved, which lets even more information through and generates a sort of funny issue sometimes around 15 kilohertz or so. But you'll hear that it has a very striking tonal quality, and that's the way that I get some of those sounds, is by those kinds of experiments and getting them to do that kind of stuff. So Bernie is mentioning that Sonic Assault Cassiopeia is a way of emulating the Casio CZ stuff, which is cool. Yeah, go ahead and experiment with that if that is something that sounds good to you. So that brings me to the end of these questions, although we still have half an hour to go. I suppose I could work on my little picture again. That could be fun. I'll take this that I've been drawing pictures with, and I'll make this be a little tiny ship while I wait for somebody else to answer a thing or to ask another question. And there you are, a little tiny ship. So Octopus and Fire mentions, oh, the Ko-fi is screwed as well because it is linked to the PayPal, and PayPal is already misbehaving for you. See, this is the problem with modern life, is that you're beholden to these enormous corporations that don't give a crap about you. And then if they're going wrong, you can't do anything about it. So you may be unable to help me buy, coffee and bread and stuff for myself until I solve some of these things, and I have to do those on my own, and they're not really going to help me and may or may not be willing to even have them be fixable. We'll see. But I will note that if I do pay Ko-fi money, they will unlock Stripe as a method for paying, not just only PayPal. In the absence of that, Ko-fi is completely tied to PayPal, and so if PayPal doesn't like you or is not working for you, it kills Ko-fi for you. These are limitations that are worth understanding. Like if you're doing your musical thing and you're looking to get paid by anybody for any purpose, it's worth learning about this kind of stuff, because that means that Ko-fi will only work as well as PayPal will work for you. And if you're running into a problem with the one, it's going to kill the other. That said, it's possible Ko-fi can be made to use Stripe, which is another kind of processing system. I think it is actually one that Patreon uses. In fact, I'll take a moment and look that up now, because why not? I'm doing a query of Patreon using Stripe for credit card processing. They are mentioning Stripe sometimes. I will note that when people have problems with Patreon sometimes, like I know there have been a bunch of right-wingers that don't get along with Patreon at all, and apparently Stripe is also a fellow traveler as far as having content guidelines. And PayPal is also a fellow traveler as far as having content guidelines. So you're not necessarily going to get away from some of people's concerns with Patreon by moving to other things like that. It's possible that the PayPal and Stripe forced Patreon to do these things. in any case, it's like, yeah, they're all tied together. You got to kind of deal with things as they are. So, do I prefer dither or noise shaping when bussing and doing mixdown? I have a very unsatisfactory answer for that. My answer is I prefer my Roland M16E for doing mixdown, and it's an analog desk. I'm capturing like the stuff that I'm doing musically, which I'll be doing again on Tuesday. I'll do a music jam for that. Is going through a fully analog mix, and a lot of the synthesizers are analog as well. And it's being captured directly into the computer through two of my magnetodynamic infundibulators, which are a transformer kind of circuit. By the way, I've worked out a little bit more about how that works. I have specific part numbers for that. So before 1 o'clock, if anybody wants to know the specific part numbers for making magnetodynamic infundibulators, I can give you a couple of specific transformers that could be ordered that ought to do about the same as mine did. But I'm capturing my final mix through those transformer devices into my Motu 16A, which is saving directly to a file, and that's what you get. So in very practical terms, the stuff that I'm doing on SoundCloud, the 2-hour-long jams and things where you can download 2496 high-res audio, that's not processed in any way. That's literally just the capture from the input with not even normalized. And I do throw some fade-ins and fade-outs in the beginning, but that's it. So it's a direct 24-bit capture from off of an analog source. That's what I'm doing currently. So that doesn't include either dither or noise shaping. That said, I can give you a different answer also, in that if I am trying to make stuff be a CD, which the current stuff I'm working with, I'm not, because it's 2 hours long and it doesn't fit onto a CD. But if I was trying to make stuff be a CD, I would have a 2-stage process. And currently, the first thing that I would do is, I've tried this in a couple of different ways. For stuff like my music jams where I have extreme high-frequency elements, like some of these brighter hi-hat sounds and things, or the farfisa, if I need to retain the super high-frequency stuff onto a CD, I'll use a Mac program called Brick. And I found out about that in some of the talk about tech recently. And it's an older program, but I was pretty happy with how it does. It really seems to maximize on the highs without having any aliasing. So I'm quite happy with how that behaves. And having used Brick to take the sample rate down, I would be then using most likely not just another dither in Studio Tan to take the bit depth down to 16-bit. And that's what I would burn onto the CD. It would be first Brick for converting the sample rate to 44.1K. And then it would be 44.1K at like 24-bit or higher, whatever I could get. I forget exactly what was working the last time I tried it, but whatever works. If I can save an intermediate file that's 32-bit and then load it as that, I would do it. And from that point onwards, I'd be using the not just another dither in Studio Tan as the take it to 16-bit and done. So that is what I would be doing for that. And yeah, honestly, what might end up happening in the long run, because I am finding a little bit that I'm slightly frustrated with the format of just my straight up synthesizer jamming. I mean, I love it and I could do it endlessly. But there is a part of me that would also like to like play acoustic drums and bass and guitar and stuff. I can play guitar along with this kinds of things, but there's other instrumentation, typically rock style instrumentation, that I can't really do, and I don't feel capable of, for instance, singing or anything along with that. And I would like to fool with the whole multi-track recording, which was most conveniently done in the computer. So what might happen there is that I would end up doing bussing and mixdown of something that wasn't one of my synthesizer jams, and doing whatever in order to get a framework for the track, and then doing a bunch of overdubbing until I had an actual song. And when I had the actual song, I would be able to, I mean, technically, I have the capacity to go out into my mixing board and mix that stuff analog as well. And I'm also interested in using like some of my hardware gear to design like analog mixing desks. Not so much that I feel I would be able to do better than like a Neve or an API or whatever, but I can do much cheaper, and I might be able to do similar things to what I did in console in the box. Like you go, okay, so console sounds good in the box. What do I have to do in a analog mixing board to make it do that, but in analog? How can I make the analog mixing board distort the way I want it to distort when combining tracks on a bus? And if I could do that, that'd be very exciting. And I'd probably be so thrilled about it that I want to be doing that rather than doing in-the-box stuff. But if I was doing the in-the-box mixing, I would probably be using the original raw console 5 with the DC offset issues, and try to select particular voices and instruments and things to minimize that as an ongoing problem. Like I'd be picking stuff where on input I'd be capturing things that didn't necessarily produce a lot of DC, or didn't produce a lot of asymmetry, rather. And then run as much stuff through the raw console 5 system, and only do the DC block stuff where necessary. Treat it as like a high passer. So there's a variety of stuff that I might do. It's complicated by the fact that though I make these plugins and though I make these in-the-box systems, I've always loved and been fascinated by analog stuff and enjoy working with it. So I've done a lot of working with analog stuff and don't really lose interest in that particularly. So yeah, it's a question, because there's two sides to everything. Like, you know, I might not be in a particularly thriving section of the country. I'm in this backwater in Vermont where life is cheaper, but I have a place to put analog gear and stuff. Like if somebody busted and tried to steal all of my analog stuff, first of all, I'd laugh at them because they wouldn't be able to get any money for any of that stuff because it's all too junky. But if that happened, I would still have a place to be in, because you can't actually steal space from somebody. You can steal the things out of the space, and then, you know, eventually I get more things to put in the space, and that's kind of the issue. But there are plenty of people who don't have that, and they're just renting an apartment or whatever under perhaps very nasty terms. And, you know, I've heard stories. I remember this one, you know, we've got 15 minutes left for the live streaming, so I can go off on this tangent. If anybody wants another question, then fire off the other question before I'm done, and I'll answer it. But I have read people talking about books. it was on Tumblr, and it was very enlightening that people were talking about how Kindle sucked because they can delete books off of your Kindle and you don't get to keep anything really. It's all just virtual, and if it's virtual, it's not really yours. It's in the cloud, and that's not real. And people saying, I just love my even paperback books because they're so tangible and real and I can read them and stuff. And then there was some pushback on that in interesting ways that I really felt, personally. One woman was talking about how she had fled a abusive relationship and she had to flee off into the night. There wasn't going to be any chance of loading up boxes with things, but she was able to throw her Kindle, and her Kindle had her whole library, and it was in the cloud. So that meant that she was able to flee a dangerous, damaging situation and still had something rather than being left with nothing. And then you've got people who have lived in so many different apartments and had so much insecurity as far as just basic stability of life and where you get to be, that they depended upon having stuff be on their computer or in the cloud because they were not going to be able to, are you going to pack up, if you're going to pack up boxes, for what purpose is it? Does that mean that you're going to have a place that you moved from and a place that you moved to? In my life, I've been in this situation of packing stuff up to put it into a friend's mother's basement because I was going to become homeless and there was going to be no place for me to put my things. Instead, I just had to find somewhere to warehouse that stuff while I hit the bricks because there was nowhere for me to go. I was very lucky, and even though I was lucky, I lost a bunch of records. I lost high school yearbooks that will never, ever be replaced, ever. Books and things, stuff like that. If you're looking at a dumpster going, I can fit into these 4 boxes and the friend's parent will not let me put more than 4 boxes in their basement, so these are the only things I'm going to have going forward, that becomes an argument for the plugins. That becomes an argument for the Kindle because, we can live in a world that is so threatening that none of this stuff matters. Like, my little pieces of paper or whatever, you might as well burn them because I could lose them forever and not be able to take them with me. I'll have nowhere to go. And I've lived that. Whereas if you scanned this into the computer, it no longer has you couldn't rescan it, you wouldn't be able to have the physical tangibleness of it, which is its own thing. But on the other hand, as long as it was saved somewhere and you had access to that with the corporation that was in charge of keeping your cloud, if they didn't screw you over like MySpace did recently, MySpace with their recent derping of backup of some kind where they're like, okay, everything that we had prior to 2015 is gone. Sorry, guys, bye. It's an entire generation of people putting their music on the cloud, thinking that that was what they were going to be able to do, and then gone. So it's complicated and tricky, goes back and forth in various ways. And because there's also another argument where you can say, oh, the cloud is so great because when people live these intensely persecuted, horrible, nightmarish lives, they get to have maybe something if they can get a phone or a computer again someday. And that, ignores the question, why would people have to live such nightmarish lives anyway? Shouldn't we be thinking in terms of letting people have homes and the ability to have like their little stuff and ability to have like their little pieces of paper that they can draw sketches on or whatever, if that's what pleases them? It's like, it's a large and complicated problem, and there are multiple angles to it. So yeah. Bernie has just chimed in with, I enjoyed the analog sound, but you're in an 11 by 7 foot room, so it's a hybrid sound, including drums, guitars, and amps. Well, I make, granted not very good, but I have made MIDI drum kits available and stuff, so there are situations where you can be like, use these things that I have supplied, and then you can not have to do drums in your room. Like I've set up my current situation here where I'm making electronic drum sounds, and I like them. I'm happy with them. I'd like to be able to include my analog snare drum in there, and generally I do that by sampling it. I had that on a small synthesizer from I want to say MDF, but that's not the German drum computer, the people that make Tanz Mouse, BFD or something. I had my snare drum on that. It's pretty decent that way. It didn't sync up very well, so I didn't end up sticking with it. But it's this whole back and forth. It's this whole complicated issue. Like, if all of my drums are on samples and they're played through a computer keyboard, or that I can program them on my laptop, well, I can do that any way I want. Or, learn how to program them so it's like, okay, the kick is pushing a little bit and the snare is sitting back, and it's not just randomized. It's MFP, thank you. It's not just randomized. It's done in the way that gets the groove that I want to the extent that I can get it, and sampled as well as I can get it. And then you're still working with samples and repeating them every time. And there is that has its own kind of merit. But I'll tell you, one of the things that I'd really like to do, and hope to at some point, like at some point I'm going to be in a position to be able to do this. I'd like to get the bass guitar that I've always wanted. Because I have this interesting back and forth around this, because I'm a fan of Yes. So I've always craved a Rickenbacker. In fact, I know where I can get a Rickenbacker 4003. I just can't afford it right now. And at some point, maybe I'll be able to do that. And at that point, I would like to do some music that is like, my drum kit, and using the Rickenbacker bass for the bass. And I've got a bunch of different guitars and can get many of the sounds that I like now. The guitars are the most close to what I would go for at this point, because I've got the guitars going through a real amp into a real speaker that is being picked up with one of my customized Shure SM57s and going into the board and stuff. And I'm capable of getting a pretty respectable guitar sound that would sit and work in a mix. And I'd like to track some of these things, but I'd like to track them in such a way that I start doing more with just like your old school progressive rock, fart nonsense, where I'm literally playing the stuff, and part of it is that human quality, that human feel of it, because I'm not the best musician of every single kind at once. Like I can fake playing keyboards a little bit. I've been playing guitar for a long time. I played drums in a number of bands, and I have a drum kit upstairs because, again, with the space. Currently, although I am relatively poor, I live in a place where I can be poor and still have some space. There's all kinds of places that could say that. For instance, if you wanted to be in a situation like mine, you could be like, okay, I'm going to move to Mississippi, and I'll talk to the world on the internet. And I'll go to some place in Mississippi where I can get property for very cheaply, and I'll do that. And you probably could, in which case you'd be able to do what I've done, which is I have a drum room. There's a room, which is a small sort of bedroom in my house that just has drums in it. And, microphones, and it's set up and it stays that way, because that is the purpose of that scenario, is so that I can in future track stuff and put the drums into a recording and use them, in that way, and pick out microphones that I like and set it up in such a way, set up the microphone positioning and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is super interesting to me, and I would really like to be able to put out also music where it's like, yeah, I put this together and I tracked it over the weekend, and this is a song, and I'm singing on it, and I'm singing a harmony on it. I thought of something that I wanted to say, and I sang it. And I played this Rickenbacker bass because it, there's also funny things about, like, if you get a Rickenbacker bass, do you go for the Chris Squire thing, get round wound strings, or like you go for the John Entwistle thing of you get roto sounds and everything has to go clang? Or do you do what, like, here's the thing, is that's not the only way to do that kind of clangy Rick bass sound, because there's a whole other aspect of it that goes overlooked by people who really like the clanginess of it. Namely, you put flat wounds on the thing, even though it is a glittery Rickenbacker that does that progressive chimey thing so well. Because if you do that, you're tapping into some of the Beatles sounds. And you're tapping into, for instance, some of the Genesis sounds. And there's this whole thing that you can get where you're using flat wound strings on this very chimey bass, and it's being all muffled and rolled off. But because it's still a Rickenbacker, the articulation of the notes and how you hit them and how, like, the string bounces off the fretboard and stuff, that remains incredibly sharp and clear. And it means you can use that instrument to do, like, your dubbier, reggae-er, like, bass things where they're more muted and muffled and like that, but with that clarity that is not necessarily that easy to get. Like, you can get a P bass and it's all about the muted and muffled, and that's mostly what it does. It sits super well in any mix where you need it to not get in the way of things. And then you've also got, like, a Mustang bass, and that's an equally interesting thing. Mustang bass, there's a name brand out there which is currently being made that has the correct configuration, which I consider to be the precision style pickup, but slightly different. It's got a different shape to the pickup, and no other pickup. There's a guy who's using those. And so they're selling this artist model, and it's the one that doesn't have the PJ split. And the thing about the Mustang bass is that will give you the Rolling Stones. Bill Wyman played one of those. That's how they got some of their sound going on. And that will also get you King Gizzard and the Wizard Lizard, because the bass player for King Giz also plays a Mustang bass, and there is a way in which the mid-range and the mid-bass of that hits off of a Mustang bass that is astonishing. So the instruments are fascinating, and it becomes a question of what dub reggae album. Well, I keep trying to do dub techno. Want me to do a more dub techno-y thing this coming Tuesday? I can see whether I can make it be more spacey. That might be fun. Let's see what we can do. I'll do something that's a little more down tempo. I've had David Pixley would like me to do 128 beats per minute, which I will sometimes do. But maybe it would be fun to do a slower thing like 109 or whatever. And because the thing about the dub reggae and dub techno, I have some of the correct synthesizers for it, which is, I'm getting to 1 o'clock, so we'll leave it at this. If you're trying to do that dub techno thing where you've got those just keyboard stabs, like, and they're very synthetic, they're very techno-y, but they just have this extraordinary resonance. Those ones, Junos, Alpha Junos are that sound. They have the analog oscillators, and then they have a resonant filter that you just crank the resonance all the way up, and it just honks. It honks and it distorts itself, and it does the most amazing dub techno stuff you ever heard. I'll see whether I can show some of that stuff off. Tune in tomorrow at 11, and I'll see if I can't go into dub techno land for a while. it'll be kind of fun. I like that anyway, so it's all good. And yeah, Squire Bronco bass. Oh no, Bo, if you only just showed up, I'm just about done. I dare say that the Squire Bronco bass would be similar to a Mustang. Let me take a moment and look at it. Hopefully, yeah. Bo, my great apologies for having to be done around about 1 o'clock or so, because I've just been going for 2 hours. And this is the day where I'm a little tired and burnt, so. So, having a little quick look at a Squire Bronco. Yeah, that's not exactly the same, but that's similar to... See, the thing about the Fender Mustang, it's the same kind of short scale bass with the same kind of bridge and the same shape of body, and all of the things about it are more or less the same as that. But the Mustang has a different pickup. And I don't know. They both could be pretty good. I don't know. I would have to try one and see. Because the thing with cheap guitars is that you can never tell. Like sometimes a cheap guitar will be amazing, and the expensive name brand ones might not be special. So it's a wooden instrument, and you're going to just see what the wooden instrument has going on. In any case, I need to take a little time to rest up a little bit. I am happy to say that I have plugins coming for the next few weeks, including High Pass 2, which is kind of similar to the Low Pass 2, except for it's the High Pass version, and it's got many of the same improvements. And I have Brass Rider, which you might not know what that is, and it's going to be challenging to demonstrate it, but it was designed for a particular person who was asking me for help with the thing. Slipperman, in fact, for those who have heard of Slipperman. Not the Genesis character, but the heavy metal mixer. And he wanted something that would ride up overhead cymbals when you hit the cymbal. So I made a plugin that literally does that. It rides up stuff, and if you're not hitting the cymbal, it doesn't ride it up. Then, after that, Smooth. And I think people will enjoy Smooth. That is a bit of a hidden wonder, really, as far as that's concerned. So I think that'll go over pretty well. And beyond that, we'll see. But we got stuff going on. Oh, dude, there's already... I think you're going to want to go with the current versions of Density and Drive, because I released VST versions of Density and Drive. When you say Density and Drive 2, those aren't really advantages over the original Density. And it's kind of like Channel, where Channel kept going through variations that were about, this is my new noise shaping, or this is my new denormalization code. You know, when I did stuff with the process that altered them, that would become Channel 2, Density 2, Drive 2, or so on. And then when I put out the VSTs, what you get with that is the VST release of Density and Drive are the most recent one. Don't be fooled by the fact that there's a Density 2 and Drive 2. And in theory, I could put those out, but I wouldn't really be happy with the fact that they wouldn't necessarily sound as good as the current versions. We'll see. That's something that I can worry about another day. We can talk about that later. In any case, for the time being, I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.